In early April 1944, a 28-year-old farmer sat on a troop train heading west out of Kentucky. Looking through the window, he noted that the oats were sowed and the spring gardens were already in bloom. It was the first time in his life he was watching the planting season happen without him. That farmer was Jim Hertzfeld. Back home in Maumee, Ohio, he had a pregnant wife named Georgette, 2 young boys, and a multi-generational family farm on Albon Road. For the first 3 years of the war, Jim stayed in Ohio under a Class IIC agricultural deferment. The government recognized that the manual labor required to produce food was a strategic necessity, and local draft boards protected men whose work kept family farms operational. But by early 1944, the U.S. Army faced a severe manpower shortage. As quotas tightened, Jim's father, Charles, approached the local draft board and told them he could handle the acreage by himself. He effectively released his only son for service. The family split apart almost immediately. Georgette, 6 months pregnant, packed up the toddlers and moved off the farm and into town. Jim reported to Fort Thomas, Kentucky for induction into the infantry. Jim was now in the military pipeline, learning to salute and pack a bag. But his letters home weren't about the Army. They were about whether the oats were in, or if Georgette had settled into the new house on Dudley Street. He was physically in a uniform, but his focus remained fixed on the failing farm and vulnerable family he'd left behind. Jim arrived at Camp Fannin, Texas on Easter Eve. He traded the dark, fertile soil of the Maumee Valley for triple-digit heat and blowing red sand that coated his rifle and filled his barracks. He was thrown into a 17-week training cycle. At 28, his body absorbed the punishment differently than the teenagers in his platoon. He spent his nights scrubbing laundry and nursing the ache in his knees and ankles after days of relentless bayonet drills. The physical strain was compounded by night problems. These were tactical exercises designed to simulate the chaos of actual combat, forcing recruits to navigate the woods in total silence or dig foxholes in the dark under the light of magnesium flares. The Army stacked these exercises on top of 20-mile forced marches. Jim operated in a state of constant sleep deprivation, often getting only a few hours of rest before the 4:30 a.m. reveille. This 17-week schedule was built to replace civilian hesitation with military reflex. By the time Jim finished, the Army expected him to respond to combat orders without the delay of a man who still thought like a farmer. Jim survived this isolation through 2 lifelines. The first was Harold Cam, a fellow recruit from Lucas County, Ohio. Their paths were mirrored from the start. They were processed in Kentucky on the same day, and their Army serial numbers were only 70 digits apart. His second lifeline was his correspondence with Georgette. He spent his limited free time writing V-mail in the brush, managing farm finances, and using dry humor to downplay his exhaustion. These letters reveal a pained internal conflict. Jim knew the farm was struggling. His mother wrote that his father couldn't keep up with the work. Yet Jim refused to openly criticize his father's decision to send him, choosing instead to focus on Georgette's pregnancy. Back in Ohio, the family tried to get him home through the Red Cross. Jim knew some men used family hardship to goldbrick or avoid deployment, but he flatly refused. He told Georgette he would finish his training straight through. That resolve finally culminated in the bivouac. For 12 days, the men lived in the Texas brush under pup tents, eating sea rations in the heat and practicing maneuvers with almost no sleep. Surviving those 12 days in the field was the final proof the Army required. Jim had endured the worst conditions Camp Fannin could throw at him, and he was ready for the front. Jim earned a 10-day graduation furlough. He returned to Maumee to eat home-cooked meals and hold his newborn son, Mike, for the first time. But a ticking clock hung over the family, counting down the days until he had to leave for the East Coast. He reported to the Fort Meade Replacement Depot in Maryland. This was a state of limbo where men sat and waited for their names to appear on a shipping manifest, knowing the next stop was the European theater. Eventually, Jim's name was called. He boarded a troop transport ship packed with thousands of other replacements and began the crossing to England. By late September, he arrived in France, stepping off onto Omaha Beach. By then, the sand was no longer a battlefield, but a massive industrial port funneling replacements into the line. In his final letters to Georgette, Jim always used a specific sign-off: keep your end gate up. It was a piece of agricultural advice. You keep the back of a farm wagon closed so you don't lose the harvest on a rough road. That single phrase defined his journey. Jim was headed into combat with the 29th Infantry Division, but he remained a farmer at his core, carrying the stoicism and protective instincts of Albon Road into the uncertainty of the German border.